Hello, and welcome back to the Elevate Your Running podcast. I'm here this week with Jonah Rosner. He is an applied sports scientist, strength and running coach based in Brooklyn, New York. Jonah has spent the last 10 years working with athletes and teams from all major American professional team sports. And most recently, Jonah was the applied sports science coordinator for the Houston Texans in the NFL. At age 25, he was one of the youngest sports scientists in NFL history. Now, Jonah specializes in using the latest sports science technology and testing to individualize running and strength programs. He recently partnered with Nike to run the Nike Running Performance Lab in New York City. Welcome to the podcast, Jonah.
Thanks so much for having me. That intro did me a lot of justice. I don't know if I'm going to live up to that hype, so hopefully, though.
I think you're going to do great. I've listened to you on a few podcasts last fall, and it's been really fun to also follow you on Instagram and follow your reels. You are science backed. I mean, you are a scientist, so that makes sense. But all of your content is so good. It's so relatable. It's so practical that I think if you're not following Jonah right now on Instagram, definitely head over there after this episode, follow Jonah, maybe sign up for his newsletter, and you're going to be, I think, highly entertained. When I was in my taper for Indianapolis, it was race week. I think I spent close to an hour on your Instagram page, just like watching your reels. And I'm like, this is everything I need for race week. This is like good vibes, good information, and it's also entertaining.
I appreciate that. I'm glad that the reels have been helpful. Some days I look at them and I'm like, oh man, I can't believe people are still like me talking in front of a croissant saying you need to eat more carbs before your marathon. But I guess it's been enjoyable for some.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's all good, relatable content and things that sometimes we need to remember throughout our training cycle and throughout our
Yeah.
years of running, our months of running, our time running, that, oh, yeah, we get to go back to the basics. We get to go back to the things that really work for us. And in today's episode, we're going to be actually talking about some of the running, what we quote unquote call the fads of running. And we're going to maybe see what Jonah thinks about them. Is he debunking these fads? Does he lean into these fads? These could be new products, these could be trends, things that are in the running marketplace over the last few years. And we're going to take a look at them and just see, like, is this something that we add into our training? Is this something that maybe moves the needle a lot, a little bit, or definitely not worth the time?
Yeah,
Are
no, it
you
sounds
ready,
great to
Jonah?
me. I love a little good myth busting.
I know. So we're going to jump right in. We're going to start with ketones. So we've seen elite athletes promote ketones. We've seen ketones all over the market. Jonah, I'd love for you to jump in and just explain what ketones are, how to use them. Are there any benefits to them? And will they help runners in the long term, short term, run stronger, faster, and further?
Amazing. Yeah, so we'll get started right out of the gate. In regards to what ketones are this energy producing molecule that your body produces, your liver produces on its own, typically when an individual is in a very low carbohydrate state, such as when someone fasts for a long period of times or when they're on a ketogenic diet. And from an evolutionary standpoint, it probably was pretty beneficial as an alternative energy source for the body when we didn't have access to a lot of carbohydrates or fuel for whatever reason. And so the thought was now that potentially if someone goes on a ketogenic diet or we give someone a ketone supplement, we give them an extra energy source by elevating their blood ketone levels. And it theoretically could that enhance endurance performance. And so now we see all these things that are exogenous ketone supplements. And the goal of those is to raise someone's ketone levels without actually being on a ketone diet or fasting diet. And so originally the thought was if we give someone ketones with that spare glycogen or your body's like stored carbohydrate source, which should improve endurance performance. But when we look at actually the research, it's really mixed. And what the research has shown from a performance standpoint, that ketones probably don't improve your endurance performance,
Mm.
especially on the shorter events from like a marathon duration or shorter, that when we take a ketone supplement, it's not going to help you run faster. It's probably not going to give you extra energy. and it's just not going to boost your performance overall. And the results really just are clear at this standpoint. What we do see though is I'm not anti ketones. I'm not exactly pro ketones either, just due to the expense of them and that the benefits are so mixed. The research, we potentially might see some benefits for ketones based on the latest research, more in a recovery standpoint, where there's potential recovery standpoint and very longer duration events. So for a longer duration event, we see that ketones may help as a energy source for the brain during these longer duration events. And from a recovery standpoint, there's two things. Ketones may help with potentially muscle damage and inflammation during long duration events like ultras or multi-stage events where you're running for multiple days or cycling for multiple days in a row, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing we see from ketones is they may help with a specific adaptation, which is that if I take ketones after a workout or key workout session, one of the key adaptations we get from endurance training is we get more red blood cells. And that's good because if you have more red blood cells, you can carry more oxygen to your muscles. That's more energy. You're probably going to run faster. And ketones potentially, when taken after workouts as a recovery modality, may help with that body's response, the erythropoietin response, EPO response, to generate new blood cells. But we actually don't have the evidence. We just see from some mixed research that potentially it raises the EPO, but we don't know if that directly improves the red blood cells and if that actually learns to long-term performance gains or benefits. So right now, what I would say is, to summarize, we have no research showing it's going to improve your performance in a marathon or shorter. If anything, it may actually hurt your performance of those events. The
Mm-hmm.
one area it may help is like recovery during very intense high training load to help with potentially inflammation and muscle damage. It might help during extremely long events where you're running for a lot of the day or multiple days as another energy source for your brain. And those are the main, and some other people report anecdotal evidence that it helps with recovery. But right now, the evidence is very mixed, and it definitely doesn't help performance in marathon distance events or shorter.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because I know someone that takes ketones during their training, during their marathon build, during their marathon race, and I think it's an interesting kind of concept to think that it could maybe help potentially not during the race, but maybe start the
Yeah,
recovery process sooner while they're running, as long as they're also supplementing with gels and the proper
yeah,
nutrition and making
exactly.
sure
I'm
that
definitely
they're
not sold on it based on the research, but that potentially is the
yeah.
area where we see it might benefit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So there's just not enough research. Ketones are new on the market. They've only been out for a few years, I believe,
Yeah,
in the form of the few brands that we know of. So we're going to put this one in the category of TBD.
yeah, I would say TBD, not worth it right now. I don't take ketones right now. As someone who's looked
Yeah.
at a ton of the research and is trying to optimize my performance in every way possible, I don't take ketones and I don't recommend ketones for anyone I work with.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a really strong statement because we didn't talk about your training. We didn't talk about you as a runner,
Yeah,
Jonah. Do you want to give some background on like your training, your running background, what
I'll
you're
give you
currently going after?
yeah, it's definitely not too impressive. So I'll make it short and sweet. My background, as we talked about, was in sports science, and a lot of that has to do with like strength and speed, power. So I got very into lifting growing up. So a lot of my background growing up was like lifting, training for strength and speed. And then in graduate school, I studied a lot of distance running. So I got a little bit more into running. Really didn't start taking distance running seriously. I would go for runs for like the past like 5 to 10 years, just out of enjoyment and interest in the science. But just
Yeah.
started taking like marathon training seriously a year and a half ago. And since then, I've run like 4 marathons now in the past year, which is probably too much. Took two of them seriously. So ran a sub 3 recently at Chicago, which was cool. And yeah, so now my training's pretty intense. I probably run 6 or 7 days a week, closing in on probably I average like 70, 80 miles with my coach. Really trying to see if we can take the latest science and everything I learned from my background in sports science and my graduate studies to optimize my training. So it's been a very exciting self experiment. And next up, I got London in the spring.
Yeah, that's so exciting for you. And I know like you ran a really strong race in Chicago and now you have the potential. I mean, London's also a great major to lean into
Yeah,
and to have a lot of fun and run strong. What has been like your greatest lesson that you've learned over the last like year and a half with marathon training?
consistency is key. I think you
Yeah.
and I talked about this before the call, and I think the
Yeah.
marathon is like the ultimate event that you can't cheat. It's about
Yeah.
stacking Brits. Like we know consistent volume and good quality training is what leads to performance of the marathon. So it's just running day after day and not thinking on one individual day or an outlier or bad day and staying consistent. And I think that probably transfers over to a lot of other elements of life.
Yeah, yeah. I said that your coach probably loves you because you have a good head on your shoulders of
Yeah,
like not getting too caught up in like, a tough day, understanding it's,
yeah,
stacking those bricks, the consistency is important. And all of the foundational pieces are such a crucial part of a running a strong marathon, although it is a tough distance to race.
yeah. It is not. It is not easy mentally. I'll say that for sure.
Yeah. All right. So, okay, ketones we've established.
Check.
Check, check. Let's move into tart cherry juice. Now,
Ooh,
I
another good one.
love so a little background. I started taking Cherry Bundy tart cherry juice at the beginning of my Indianapolis build, which was right around like August, September of 2024. And I would take it daily. I really enjoyed it. I thought I felt better, thought it reduced the inflammation. It felt like I recovered a little bit better. Some days I would take 2 servings, depending on how hard of a day I had. My Wednesdays are typically like when I'm in full training, it could be anywhere from, running a workout in the morning, a double at night, 16 to 17 miles. I'm also coaching at night. So there's quite a bit of things just happening in my day. So they claim that, tart cherry juice claims that it can reduce inflammation and encourage faster recovery. Jonah, what do you think?
Yeah, I actually think the evidence behind tart cherry juice is pretty decent from that standpoint. Again, it is a supplement, so the other things like sleep and good nutrition come first. But
Yeah.
just exactly what you said, when you exercise, you produce these things called reactive oxygen species, just part of the exercise metabolism. They're not a bad thing, but they do cause a little bit of damage, cause some inflammation. And cherry juice is rich in something, or tart cherry juice is rich in what we call antioxidants and other anti-inflammatory compounds. Those just help deal with those reactive oxygen species, which can potentially and probably does, based on a lot of the research, slightly reduce soreness and can help you accelerate that recovery after exercise. So I'm definitely a fan of them, and I'm definitely specifically a fan of them during high volume like training load periods where you're in like the peak of training, because it could just help you recover and put in more high quality training when during those phases. That's probably the goal. And there might be times of the off season where we actually don't want it because a little bit of inflammation and some of those reactive oxygen species are actually a signal for adaptation. And in the
Hmm.
off season, if we're a little extra sore and we have time to recover naturally and can get some of those other adaptations, that may not be a bad thing. But overall, I'm a decent fan of tart cherry juice. I've used it in a lot of team sports too.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it's something I've definitely, like, I kind of, yeah, I guess I have stopped taking it after running Indianapolis. And I'm in kind of in this like speed season. So my mileage is a little bit lower, the intensity's higher, but I don't feel like I need it as much as
Yep,
when I'm in a big marathon build.
exactly.
The mileage is
Exactly.
high. Yeah.
Exactly. It's exactly how I would use it.
Are there any other oxidants that you know of that you feel like could be of the same benefit?
I mean, I think like if you look at something like fish oil, pretty similar,
Yeah.
right? Anti-inflammatory effects, helps with recovery. I mean, from an overall physiological health standpoint, fish oil has a load of benefits. I think pretty much everyone should take fish oil. Fish oil. But if we're talking like from a performance standpoint, recovery standpoint, fish oil has some similar anti-inflammatory and cardiovascular benefits. And then people take other things from like the reactive oxygen species standpoint, but the main one probably is that tart cherry juice.
All right, great. So we have tart cherry juice in the yes, let's do it bucket.
Let's do it.
Why not? And for those of you who haven't, like, maybe you haven't tried Cherry Bundy, you can go to your local grocery store and just get
Yeah, they're
the,
everywhere.
yeah, it's everywhere. Like, you can just get the tart cherry juice off of the shelf. And I find some at Whole Foods. They have it right in the juice aisle, super easy to find and easy to consume.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure.
Great. All right, let's go into creatine. Now, this is like a buzzword right now, and maybe it's just
Yeah.
because like one person started talking about it, and now I just hear all these runners and athletes talking about creatine. I'd love for you to dig and dive in deep on this one. What is creatine?
I could
What?
definitely dive in deep in about, oh, sorry for interrupting, but I
No,
can
you're
definitely give
good.
a deep dive about creatine. Creatine, if we just start from the beginning, creatine is this naturally occurring compound in all your muscles. And it's an energy source. It's a compound that's an energy source. And it's typically an energy source for very high intensity, short duration events, like a 5 to 10 second all-out sprint. Your body uses creatine. Phosphocreatine is the main energy source. Probably not fat, probably not a little bit of carbs, whatever, a little bit of oxygen, but a lot of it's that phosphocreatine. And that phosphocreatine we get from things like meat and other sources, where a lot of times it's just our diet these days. We don't get enough creatine based from a dietary standpoint. So it has benefits from a muscle standpoint in regards to providing that energy for those high intensity, short duration events. But it also has a lot of other physiological benefits, just whether it's health or performance in general. From the standpoint, those benefits from like an energy source from your brain, over our brain, recovery. And so the way the supplementation works when you see people take creatine supplements is it naturally increases those creatine stores in your muscle, which enhances the amount of ATP your muscle produces from that creatine. And the ATP is your muscle's main energy source, and especially during those intense efforts, that the ATP from that creatine. And recently, there was a really interesting paper from Scott Forbes's group that actually looked at, we know creatine helps short duration, high intensity events, but could it potentially help longer duration events, specifically longer duration running events? We definitely don't have conclusive evidence that we can say if you take it, it's going to help you run a faster marathon. We don't have that evidence. But what we can say is it may potentially have some benefits that could help. And one of those benefits, if we go down the potential benefits, is it might enhance those high intensity effort days, or definitely probably will. Like during marathon training, you probably do some elements of sprints, like very fast track sessions. Or you think about the
100.
end of a race, maybe there's a kick at the end where you have to sprint to the finish if you have
Hmm.
that energy left, or you're running up a hill and it gets really hard and intense. Creatine's going to help all those sessions. So if you get a better sprint session in, you get a better track session in, you might get a better adaptation. The other thing we know creatine does is that when we combine creatine with carbohydrates, which you probably should have in your diet, it actually probably enhances glycogen storage. And that's really important. The more glycogen we can store, we're probably going to delay fatigue and it's going to help us during most of our running efforts. Glycogen, or those stored carbs in your muscle, another energy source, is going to be your main and most efficient energy source during distance running events. And then there's other things, potentially like it's probably going to help you recover from those high intensity efforts. We have some research about that, and that can be beneficial as well. And it may help you be a little more efficient. So the one area, which I'm sure you've probably heard about too, is that creatine may increase your body weight, which runners tend to worry about. And they say, well, couldn't that offset the benefits from long distance runners? For me, I don't worry about that with the body weight at all, honestly. I think the benefits are going to far outweigh that, and I don't even think small gains in weight really hurt running performance from my experience
Yeah.
and what the research is showing now. I actually think a more fueled runner and increases in body mass a lot of times actually help runners from my experience. But if that is something you worry about, you can just cycle off it potentially before the race and you would lose that body weight anyway.
Hmm.
So we typically historically have recommended for athletes in high intensity sports, but I have everyone take it not only just for the potential benefits for endurance runners, but the overall potential benefits for health because of the brain health functions, the muscle health functions, and just the overall health impact it has physiologically for males and females. It has a lot of benefits for females as well.
That's incredible. So, for someone who's looking to maybe potentially add this into their training because the benefits are maybe you can run up the hill faster, maybe you can kick in the race a little bit better, you recover faster. Those are all, as a coach
Yeah,
and as an athlete, I'm like, heck yes, that sounds
yeah,
amazing. Because I think it all kind of leads to the potential of having maybe a stronger race day because you're doing some right things in
exactly.
training. How does someone start
Yeah,
creatine? Because there is kind of a process to it.
yeah, 100%. First of all, when we get creatine, we want to look for creatine monohydrate. That's been the most studied supplement, and that's just the type of creatine you want. We know it's the most effective. So historically, there's been two ways for you to go about creatine. You could do a loading phase where people take like 20 grams a day for the first week, and then a maintenance phase of the 5 grams. For runners, I don't recommend that. I would just start taking 5 grams every day, and then within about a month, you should get to the creatine level that you want from it. So just 5 grams a day is what I typically recommend from a creatine monohydrate.
Great. And is there like a certain time of day that works better than others, or it can just be
I
consumed
don't,
whenever?
yeah, people have always tried to say like, oh, take it before or post workout. I don't think it matters. Just take it every day based on what I've seen in the science.
Great. And when an athlete, let's say an athlete were to cycle off it, how would they do that? Do they stop cold turkey? Is there kind of like a withdrawal
Yeah,
process?
I usually just have them stop cold turkey and they tend to
Okay.
do fine a few weeks before. Honestly, none of the runners I would not actually cycle off anymore because I convinced them that it probably won't matter too much and they would prefer just to stay on it. So, but if
Yeah.
you would, I would just cycle off it like 2 to 3 weeks before, maybe 3 weeks before the
Okay,
race.
cool. Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. And you use it in your training.
I've probably taken creatine every day for the past 10 years and I'm still here. So there we go.
You started this craze, didn't you,
It
Jonah?
might have been me. Yeah. Before I was in distance running, you could blame it on me.
No, that's great. That's great. So it sounds like almost every type of runner could benefit from it in certain ways, from
Yeah.
the sprinter, the 5K to the marathon distance.
I mean, if you're a sprinter or even 5K, I would
Mhm.
hands down take it. But even marathoners, I have take it for sure.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. We're going to add that into our yes column.
Definitely a big yes.
Great. Next up, we have bicarb or
Yeah.
bicarbonate. This is also another like buzzword that seems to be popping up quite a bit in the running community. If anyone has been following David Roche, he just had two stellar performances at the Leadville 100 and the Javelina 100, winning
Yeah.
both of those races. He talks a lot about adding bicarb into his routine. Jonah, I'd love to hear what you think about it, and maybe first explain what it is.
Yeah. It's a great, bicarb is definitely all the rage right now. So it's definitely a super interesting one to go over. So yeah, when we think about bicarb, it's kind of similar where we know that it's mostly going to be helping those high intensity workouts or races. We typically think about durations of like even 10 minutes or shorter for those very high intensity events. And essentially what bicarb is, when we look at the science, is sodium bicarbonate is its full name, and it acts as what we call a buffering agent. And so what that means is when you run really hard above that second lactate threshold, like we like to call it, and essentially those are just those efforts that are really hard and intense where people historically have said you get that lactate burn. It's not actually lactate causing the fatigue, but we could talk about that another day. But any kind of event above that lactate threshold, or that very high intensity event, we get lactate, but alongside the lactate, we get a buildup of hydrogen ions. And those
Mhm.
hydrogen ions cause acidity in your muscles, and those which cause fatigue. And so your body has this natural buffering system or way of getting rid of those hydrogen ions by mixing it with carbon dioxide. You breathe it out. But long story short is sodium bicarbonate helps buffer those hydrogen ions, so it just helps your body get rid of them. So if your body is better at getting rid of those hydrogen ions, it's going to help reduce that acidity in your muscle, and that's going to help you exercise for longer at those higher intensities above your second threshold. So less acidity in the muscle, you're going to delay fatigue. You can run harder for longer, especially at those high intensity efforts. Um, which is probably going to be beneficial. Exactly what we said. The main thing is it's going to delay fatigue. And so, how would you use it in training? I definitely would only use it in those higher intensity track days. So, maybe like 1 to 2 times per week, especially when I'm exercising at that threshold or above the threshold or before races. I wouldn't recommend taking it more than 1 to 2 times per week. And so, we have some research that shows that, well, first of all, if my high intensity interval sessions are at a better intensity, I can hold it for longer. Again, same principle. Maybe it's a better adaptation for that better training quality I would get.
Mhm.
But there actually is some interesting research that shows that bicarb can boost the aerobic adaptations, like improvements in your VO2 max you get from those high intensity sessions. So it's an interesting paper, a few papers that explored that. So one way to use it is before your high intensity track sessions, and it can help boost the adaptations you get from those sessions. And the other one is in races, like how David Roche has been taking. We definitely know it's gonna boost your performance in like shorter, high intensity races again, like that 5K shorter distance again. But it also
Yeah.
may help you in like if you're again, your marathon has a hill where sprint finishes when you're exercising at a very high intensity. It might help there as well because of those sprint and hill finishes where you might accumulate some of those hydrogen ions when you're running really fast. And then Morton just had an interesting paper. A paper came out that showed it may aid in longer events. That even in these longer events where we're exercising below that threshold, we still will get some elements of muscle acidity. We will get a little bit of hydrogen ions probably. So even at these sub-threshold intensities, we saw from the paper it may aid in reducing the acidity of the muscle in those intensities. And theoretically, if I can reduce the acidity in those sub-threshold events as well, it should help performance for them. Should allow me to run at that pace for longer, delay fatigue, and potentially like there was an interesting one where the participants are actually able to burn more carbohydrates per hour with the bicarb, which is a very efficient energy source. So by burning more carbs, they were consuming less oxygen and were more efficient. So again, we have a lot to learn about bicarb and more research to do, but I
Hmm.
definitely personally think there's potential benefit in it, specifically during high intensity events, training sessions to boost those aerobic adaptations you get from it, which in turn may help you during a marathon and maybe taking it before races, especially those with like sprint finishes or hills included in them.
Yeah. If an athlete were to take it before a race, do you recommend that they try it in some of their long runs that have like some
100%.
sort
Yeah, so that it's true historically with bicarb is you need to put it with high levels of sodium to
Yeah,
help the absorption process. That's why it's called sodium bicarb. And those extremely high levels of sodium actually cause stomach distress. So historically, one of the main issues with bicarb is people get huge GI stress with it, and it destroys their running. And so the modern system became popular because they claimed that the way they deliver it reduces GI stress, and we see some research that shows that. So you definitely don't want to try it for the first time on a race day just because of the potential of the GI stress it can cause.
absolutely. So
So
how we
build your
show
tolerance
yeah,
slowly. Start small and increase to reach the full recommended dose that a lot of the products will recommend you.
yeah, that's a great way to do it. And also, like how we show up in training, it's how we show up on race day. We want to make sure that we're also using anything that we potentially want to use on race day in training to make sure it works. That includes gels, hydration, sodium. If you're using bicarb, definitely practice. And also know that there are a few or one specific drawback, which is GI distress, which is not fun for any runner.
Definitely not fun.
No. All right, let's head into the next quote unquote fad. Now, this is a bit more, I think, mainstream, and it's the caffeine and the caffeine usage. But I know over the last few months, this has also been a topic that's been coming up at least a lot in the articles that I've been reading and people that I've been following about how much caffeine to actually
Yeah,
take before and during, let's say, a marathon, and also is there any benefit to maybe reducing your caffeine intake before a race and then pumping it up quite a bit on race day?
all great questions and some of my favorites. First of all, caffeine is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
The evidence is so clear that it's going to help performance in just a lot of different events, short durations, long durations, high intensity, low intensity. I mean, I probably don't need to tell anyone who listens to this, but caffeine is going to increase your alertness. It's going to reduce how hard your running feels, and it's going to enhance your endurance performance. I mean, for me, it's a staple in life. I can't really get through my day without caffeine at this point, which may not be good. Definitely am a
Same.
big believer of the caffeine performance enhancing and just Jonah everyday functionality enhancing that it has at this point.
Mhm.
And so, in regards to your questions, we definitely know that it helps with performance when taken before an event. And what we want to do is caffeine takes about 60 minutes to peak in the blood, 60 to 90 minutes to peak in the bloodstream when you're going to get the most effects, benefits. So we want to take it probably around 60 minutes before exercise is most common and what I recommend. And we want to do it based on body mass. So I recommend 30 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight 60 minutes before the event. And that's a lot of caffeine. Like I can go 400 milligrams sometimes before the event, 500 milligrams. And that's within that range for me. And I feel fine with it. But again, just like we talked about before, test it, right? Because there is potential side effects to caffeine, like jitters or the GI issues as well. So I would
Yeah.
slowly build up your tolerance, test it as well. If you feel like you're getting benefits from like that 3 milligram per kilogram body weight, probably don't need to go up too much more. Just test it, make sure you feel good. And that's pre. And if we don't have as much concrete evidence for exact loading or how you should take it during a race to improve performance, I
Yeah.
definitely think, and I think we have some good evidence that shows it will improve performance especially during a longer duration event, if you take it early on and probably during the middle, because of how long it takes to peak of the bloodstream. So, for example, if I run a 3 hour marathon, I'm going to take caffeine during the first third to one half of my race. So I get the benefits during the second half. And I typically recommend 200 milligrams total during a marathon. Don't like to go above that. 100 milligrams too. 100 or 200 is easy because that's what most of the gels have in them now as well. So, for
Yeah.
example, like if I'm taking a gel every 20 minutes, my 40th minute gel, if I'm running a 3 hour marathon, will be 100 milligrams of caffeine, and my 80th minute gel. That way they peak during the second half of the race to help from a performance standpoint. And again, just test that in your training as well to make sure that you don't have any negative side effects.
Yeah, because that's a huge piece to it, making sure you feel good, you feel strong, and that it's also working when you want it to work. Like,
Yeah,
historically, I would take a caffeine gel at like mile 16 of a marathon and I would like preload with caffeine, but that would be like my first caffeine gel. And then over this last cycle, I got a little bit better with the caffeine intake and I was taking two caffeine gels during training runs and I also applied that to Indianapolis. I took one at mile 4 and again at mile 12 and it really seemed to help, at least in that sense of being able to continue to run as strong as I could throughout that race. But you are saying like that 60 to 90-minute window is kind of what we should be looking at, maybe a little bit closer
yep,
to 60 minutes. Like if someone is to take a gel and they kind of want it to land right around mile 20 to kind of give them a boost into that last 10K, is there kind of a recommendation? Would it be like an hour before they run to
yeah.
mile 20? Yeah.
I would say like an hour to 90 minutes, exactly what you just said. And then the
Okay.
last point to bring up, what you touched upon, is if we need to abstain from caffeine the week of the race to get the maximum benefits. Some people I know too, I know anecdotally really like this. We see based on the science, you'll still get the benefits if you abstain or not. So I typically recommend people don't abstain from caffeine. The research kind of shows that you're still going to get all the benefits if you keep your normal caffeine consumption. So I tend not to have people abstain from caffeine.
That's so great. That is great news. That
Yeah, I
could be
was going
the
to say
best
that's the
news.
best news of the podcast.
Because can you imagine? Like, I drink quite a bit of caffeine every day, and I couldn't imagine having to reduce that down, especially during a taper. Your body's already going through a lot of funky changes. It's trying to recover as hard as possible. Sometimes you don't feel as good as you want to in a taper. So to also have to like reduce your caffeine intake would be, I think that'd be really tragic. So I'm glad that we get to keep it all in our taper and we get to proceed as normal
There you
heading
go.
into race day.
There you go. The best news of the day for sure.
Yeah. And I've shared this tip before on the podcast, but something that I really like to do before racing a marathon is I will consume 2 or 3 shots of espresso like 90 minutes before the race. And I like that better than just like cups of coffee. It
Love
feels
that.
better on the
Yeah.
stomach. It's a little less
Yeah.
volume and you still get that like caffeine punch when you want it.
No, I love it. Big espresso fan. Big fan of espressos
Yeah.
pre-race.
Yeah, yeah, it's the way to go. All right, so caffeine is a big heck yes, probably at the top of the list.
My number one.
Number one. All right. Now we have next up is a double threshold
Ooh,
session. Now, this is a concept, and this is like also kind of, this is a lot. This could be its own podcast episode. So maybe you come back on and we talk about double threshold.
yeah.
But a lot of people, this is also very buzzy. A lot of people are asking about it. A lot of people are curious about it. What is a double threshold session?
So another great buzzword for sure. So double threshold session. I mean, training twice in one day has been along for a very long time. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people give the Norwegians credit for inventing this, and they're definitely incorporating it very well, especially on like the triathlon side, some of the middle distance running side. But essentially, a double threshold session is we talked about that second lactate threshold before, and that lactate threshold is really important because that represents a metabolic steady state. It's like your 1 hour pace, but essentially, when you went above it, your body goes haywire and it just can't sustain that pace for too long. And when you are below it, you can sustain that pace for a good a lot of time. So because it's that metabolic steady state and like that hour pace, your marathon has to be below it. So if you raise this threshold higher and higher, your marathon pace theoretically could be higher and higher, which is important for a marathon runner. So it's a training methodology where you run two threshold workouts Like when people do like 1K repeats, which are often at their threshold pace, they do two of those workouts in one day. A lot of times, like they do longer reps for one of the longer intervals for one of them, shorter intervals for the other, one with shorter rest times. And the goal is to move that threshold up as high as possible. And the key with the double threshold sessions is they are very careful with the intensity they run at. So instead of being like a 7 or 8 out of 10, they're often doing like 6 or 7. So they reduce the intensity of each of those sessions. And because the session intensity is reduced, they're able to do 2 sessions in a day, and that's going to lead to more volume, more threshold volume. And the idea is that more controlled threshold volume can potentially move that threshold up and improve your performance. So essentially working on that ability to recycle lactate and that lactate tolerance and sustaining higher intensities. There was an interesting paper that came out recently about, is it better than one longer session in a day? And they had some interesting points. The runners found who did the double session, they were less fatigued the next day. And essentially also like by the second session, they were less fatigued. And we get this thing during longer sessions called physiological drift, where like by the end of the session, because you have fatigue, your body isn't as efficient anymore. So
Hmm.
your heart rate may be higher for the same pace. You might be running a little differently. You're just not as efficient anymore. And that potentially can hurt the quality of that longer session. So by splitting it up, you get two better, higher quality sessions, and maybe you recover better. And you just get more controlled training volume. And high quality training volume is a really important stimulus to get better. So if you accumulate more threshold volume throughout the week and more high quality training volume, then maybe you're going to get better adaptations. And they think that by splitting it up, potentially you could. And they often do it 1 or 2 times per week, and they'll be very careful with the intensity to make sure they don't go too fast. Because when they cross that threshold and they go too fast, it comes with a much larger recovery cost, and the
Yeah.
runners often won't be able to recover from that. And so, who should use it? I definitely only recommend it for very advanced athletes who have a
Yeah.
large training base,
Yeah.
working with a coach whose body physiologically, neuromuscularly is used to high running volume.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few friends that have dabbled in this area, and it's been really fun to watch them with it
Yeah,
because it's something I haven't tried before. It's something I'd definitely be open to trying as I kind of progress in my own training and trying to do new things to get faster at the marathon distance. Now, are the double threshold sessions like are they the same duration of in the morning and in the afternoon, or is one maybe a little bit longer?
it depends really on the plan. Like a lot of times they do like a longer or shorter in the morning or afternoon, but the overall volume may be the same. Sometimes the shorter interval one is just less overall volume. It's more just about increasing the total volume accumulated in that day
Yeah.
around that threshold.
Yeah, that makes sense. So this can fall into the bucket of it depends on the type of athlete you are and where you are in your training. And, if you're working with a coach, I think it's really important that if you are doing this, you have someone else kind of looking over your training and making sure that it's also the right decision and the right move.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Spot on. And it's really interesting too, like we said, like maybe a good stimulus for those who have that training.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's head into the next one, which is this is one of those things that maybe it's definitely not a fad. Maybe it is, but it's heart rate monitor. And I know as a coach, I hear all the time, but my heart rate's low, coach. But they're
Yeah,
looking at their heart rate off of their wrist, which isn't really the best way that we can evaluate our heart rate. And then obviously, we all have different heart rate zones. Can you speak more to the idea of wearing maybe a heart rate monitor or a chest strap or an arm strap versus what's coming from the rest?
yeah, 100%. I mean, first off, right off the bat, I'll just say I don't really like the heart rate from the wrist.
Yeah.
So they use two different types of technology if you wear a chest strap versus a wrist strap. So the smartwatches use optical sensors. And essentially what those do is they shine a light. They look at your veins, how big your veins are. Because when your blood pumps more, your heart rate's higher, your veins theoretically should get larger. And
Yeah.
it uses that to predict your heart rate. And we just know those optical sensors in the smartwatch are less reliable. They're okay for rest, but they're definitely less reliable at higher intensities, which is running, right? Like anytime you do any kind of high intensity activity or like running, your heart rate's elevated. And they're definitely not accurate during like your intense sessions.
Yeah.
So I tend to avoid the wrist strap. The chest straps actually use the electrical signals, so they are that electrical based device. And we just know those are significantly more accurate, especially at intensity. The armband ones, like the Coros or the Polar ones you wear on your upper arm, they're actually much better. They're closer to the heart, and they're not as accurate as just chest straps, but they're like 99%. So I always recommend either a chest strap or an armband.
Yeah, definitely. And I've noticed, I mean, I have a chest strap, just the difference when I was using wrist heart rate data and then I switched over to a heart rate strap, the immediate difference of what my easy, quote unquote, easy runs, zone 2 runs looked like and how much different that heart rate data was. And it
Exactly.
also aligned more with like how I was feeling versus like what the data was showing from my watch. I'm like, this doesn't really make sense. I don't think it was that hard of an effort, even though the watch was indicating that.
Yep, exactly. Spot on.
Yeah, great. Okay, so our last kind of like fad. Now, this maybe is like a fading fad. I don't know, but intermittent fasting. Sometimes I will work with an athlete who says, Coach, I don't eat until 12 o'clock in the afternoon, and I only eat between 12 and 6 p.m., but I run at 5 a.m. What what do you suggest? What are your thoughts around intermittent fasting and
Yeah.
the craze around this?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I just had this conversation the other day, and I think health nutrition and performance nutrition are two totally separate things. And I
Yeah,
think recently, like longevity and health research has really come to the forefront. And for the large majority of America, actually, the issue is too many calories in a day, like overabundance of energy.
yeah,
Which for them, like some of these strategies like intermittent fasting or only eating for a small window of the day, it just naturally helps them reduce the amount of calories they eat in a day, which can be helpful for overall health goals
yeah,
to be in an energy deficit for a bit. But I think in the day, the main goal is to be in energy balance, especially as an athlete. And energy balance just means that you're eating enough calories to support your training. And the issue with intermittent fasting, especially for endurance athletes who have very high energy demands or they need a lot of calories in the day to support their training because of all the calories they burn through training, is intermittent fasting makes it very hard to get enough calories in a day if you're running a lot.
yeah,
Um, we had an interesting paper come out recently that showed that runners who intermittent fast actually had higher injury rates and overall who had more risk of low energy availability or calorie deficits. And the reason is when we're in a calorie deficit, especially carbohydrate deficit, we know like bone stress, your body doesn't have enough energy to recover well. So like it won't put as much energy or calories towards bone remodeling, tissue remodeling, muscle rebuilding. And that puts you at risk for injury. So that's what they saw from that intermittent fasting research. And you brought up another excellent point. If I'm intermittent fasting, and I'm doing hard runs in the morning, you're probably not recovering or feeling for those runs perfectly. Especially if you have like a hard run that's like longer than 90 minutes with intensity. We know that fueling that session is important. I think you should probably fuel all sessions for high volume training, mostly for the recovery and performance benefits. It's gonna help you recover better eating before. But if you have a hard run that's longer than 90 minutes, like in the morning, your liver glycogen and other carb source is not topped up because it gets used during the night by the vital organs. And you want that liver glycogen to support training, especially during the end of that hard run. So you need to top off that with carbs in the morning.
hmm
And the other thing is, it's definitely going to help you recover. We've had some interesting research come out now too that having carbohydrates around the run is going to help recovery. It may not be like that whole glycogen resynthesis anabolic window thing, but it will help next day performance. So if you're not, the sooner you get into the better. So if you're not having protein carbs after your run too, you're going to hurt your next day performance because you probably just won't recover as fast. So the two main points are you're going to have a hard time eating enough in a day. And as an endurance athlete, you need those calories and it's going to put you at injury risk and performance risk. And number two is it's going to make it hard to fuel your sessions and recover from them, which would, yeah, just hurt the overall training quality.
Yeah, I mean, that makes so much sense. If you think back to like maybe any training session that you've had and maybe you didn't fuel as best as you wanted to. I know sometimes after like a really long Wednesday session, if I
Yeah,
consume a lot of food within like 60 minutes of that session, I notice the difference in my energy
huge,
levels, how I feel, even waking up the next day
huge.
and going out for that recovery run, it's so drastic versus I'm rushing
Same.
around not eating enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think those two things. First of all, the Wednesday Saturday hard split is classic. Love it.
Yeah.
I'm the same. Love the Wednesday Saturday. So shout out there. Number
Yeah.
two is like after those workouts, your muscles and your body is primed to use that nutrition. So your
Hmm.
muscles, the state that they're in, they're better at reabsorbing those carbs for glycogen, all those different things too. So it's just going to help with your recovery. So it's really important to get it in. And like you said, I feel the same. Like I know I recover better. I feel better. And we just have some really good research coming out too that's going to help you run better the next day, kind of like you said.
Yeah. And that's ultimately the goal, right? Like, I'd rather
Yeah,
feel
stack days.
tired. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say that's the goal to stack good day after good day. And
Yeah.
post-workout nutrition is a huge part of that to make sure you recover for that next day.
Yeah, I mean, who wants to go out for a recovery run and feel like garbage? Like that is not actually the point. Like, you
Exactly.
want to be able to work hard in that fast track session, recover enough where you can get in a solid recovery run and not be just totally
Yeah,
spent and feeling awful. Now, I want to
exactly.
give a big shout out to your advice about adding in fructose to a carb load before a marathon because I was always someone who just went into a carb load as let's eat as many carbs as I can. We're going to balance this out. For this last marathon build, I added in fructose during the day and then of course the morning of the marathon to help my liver glycogen stores.
Liver
Is that right?
glycogen. Yeah,
Yeah.
spot on. It's really
Yeah.
interesting point on. You have a few different main types of carbohydrates. If we break down carbs to the simplest forms, you have glucose, fructose, galactose. We'll just worry about fructose and glucose. Those are the ones that matter the most for us.
Yeah.
So glucose are those common things like rice, potatoes, like just the classic carb sources. Pasta is glucose carbs, and that's gonna be really good for filling your muscle glycogen. If we make it very simple, your body will turn that into glucose when you consume it, and that glucose can be stored as glycogen, your muscle's main energy source for a carb load. Like you need that a few days the day before your race for it to be stored in the muscle. And fructose is another carb source, which can be stored as muscle glycogen as well too. But the thing that's interesting about fructose, which again, like some of the health longevity research paints in a bad light because overconsumption of like high fructose corn syrup can be negative. But fructose goes to your liver first. And you have two main places you store carbs, muscles and the liver. And the liver's job with those carb it stores, the liver glycogen, it sends that in the blood as blood glucose to your vital organs for energy, like your brain runs on carbs, your brain runs on glucose, your heart, all those things require energy. And it manages your blood glucose, right? Like you hear people talk about, oh, my blood glucose is low, I'm going to pass out. So your liver helps manage that blood glucose to keep it even, which is really important. And that's what bonking actually is, where you go through a period where the blood glucose drops too low. That's why you get dizzy and your brain doesn't have enough energy. But as we talked about, the thing that's really interesting, fructose goes to your liver first. And so the thing that fructose is really good for is topping up the liver glycogen stores. And so during a good carb load, the few days before your race, you'll fill up your muscle glycogen, which is going to be your primary energy source during the race. But the issue is overnight, your liver glycogen, like your brain still operates overnight and your heart, all those vital organs. So your
Yeah.
liver glycogen will get used up. So you wake up in the morning, your muscle glycogen is probably still good from the carb load. You probably want to top it off a little bit with a good pre-race meal. But
Yeah.
your liver glycogen is probably going to be a little bit not empty, but it will be have taken a hit overnight. And so we want to optimize fructose to the way we do it is 2-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose in that pre-race meal. We just want to make sure we have some fructose in that pre-race meal because we want to top off that liver glycogen. That's going to give your liver an extra energy source for your race, and it's going to help manage your blood glucose during the race, which can give you good energy during that latter half of the race, the end of the race, where your body may need an extra carb source, right? So definitely
Yeah.
have fructose. Same reason we want fructose in our gels when we're doing high fructose rates too. It's
Yeah.
another carb source, so your body can extra energy.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you haven't tried that, maybe in your next marathon prep, definitely try adding fructose. It's a 2-to-1 ratio to glucose.
Yeah, and like we'll just like the best ones for like a pre-race meal, like most drink mixes have fructose in it. Like you go Morning, the Precision Fuel, Raw Nutrition, they all have it in it. And then like apple juice, orange juice, jam, jelly, all those things.
Yeah, which is pretty
Banana,
easy
honey,
to consume. Yeah, that's easy to
easy,
consume. It's like a
classics. Yep,
runner's dream, right?
exactly.
Awesome. So we went through the entire list of these like running fads that have come on the market, kind of come into the running space. Jonah, you've like debunked them or maybe have put them in your on your yes list, your number one
Yeah,
yes.
my number
Now,
one, caffeine.
number one is caffeine. We all love it. Most of us love it. Now, at the end of the day, all these fads are so great, right? But can you kind of run through the foundational pieces that runners should really be leaning into to kind of get the most out of their training,
Yeah.
their racing, and their recovery?
Yeah, I think like we talked about, these are the 1% things, right? Like
Yeah.
99% actually isn't this stuff. And if we
Yeah.
talk about what the 99% is, that's really going to take your performance to that level and help you run a fast marathon. It's probably the harder stuff or the basics that people don't always want to hear. That's not a quick pill or a quick fix. And so what we see from the research, if we think about performance and recovery, the two areas we want to optimize, there's a few things that really matter. Consistent, well-planned training over time. So slowly increasing your training volume, slowly increasing your intensity over time, having hard days, easy days, time to recover, with a
Yeah.
well-periodized or well-structured plan that goes general specifically to your race. That's probably number one. Good training. Number two, or they matter in different extents depending on where you are. Nutrition, solid, like like good nutrition, eating enough during the day, eating enough protein, eating enough carbs, good sources fueling your runs is going to
Mhm.
make all the difference in performance and recovery. And then from a recovery standpoint, nutrition is a big one, but also like sleep. Happy if you need to, getting your 8 hours, maintaining a consistent sleep schedule, like
Yeah.
stress, managing stress, those are the big ones. Like for me, those are the big rocks. Training, nutrition, sleep, and just good recovery in general, stress management.
Yeah, stress management's huge too. And if you can keep your stress levels low, like I was saying, the week of the race for Indianapolis, it was also election week. So I
Yeah,
opted
that
to
was
like block
a
that
lot.
out.
A lot going on that week for sure.
And I ended up, watching your reels for about an hour. And, it's like finding those things that can bring you joy, that can make you laugh. And that can also be spending time with people outside of training that do that as
Yeah,
well to really bring your stress levels down. And it can make all the difference.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Exactly. It's like people don't realize like exercise is a stress too, and stress is stress. And if you have so
Yeah.
much life stress, it's going to be hard to adapt to the exercise stress.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's all one in one bucket. Your body doesn't know the difference between
Exactly.
all the different types of stresses. So, doing what you can to stay low stress, happy, healthy, all the things as we head into the new year. That is the goal. Jonah, thank you so much for your time today. It was great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Like I said, I love a good myth busting session.
You were great at it. I really appreciate you. Now, for our followers who may want to connect with you online, I know we kind of mentioned it early in the episode, but do you mind sharing where our audience can find you?
Yeah, the two best ways. The number one best way is definitely my newsletter right now, where I share very in-depth guides. That's Marathon Science. There's also a link in my bio on Instagram, which is also one of the most popular, like the reels we were talking about. That's Rosner Performance, my last name. I'm sure you can link to them, which is RSNER, and then Performance, and then the newsletter is Marathon Science. And yeah, I really appreciate you having me on. So like just as a thank you for anyone who listens, if you go to my Instagram, I'll set it up that you guys, anyone who listens to this podcast or is referred through you sign up for the newsletter and you get a free strength training plan for your next marathon. So that just gets sent to you automatically when you sign up to the newsletter.
There we go. That's huge. That's
Yeah,
awesome. I think that's a great value add. And strength is one of those things that can get so funny with athletes. They don't know where to start, they don't know what to
yeah,
do. They think it needs to be this overly complicated process, and it really doesn't have to be. And Jonah's going to be your guide to make sure that you can
hope
show
so.
up as strong as possible for your
Yeah,
next marathon build, which is incredible.
awesome. Yeah, no, I appreciate you taking the time as well. This has been awesome. Love the podcast. It was a ton of fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jonah. And I hope everyone has a great week.
Yeah.